Welcome to Alpha Coding Podcast, an all-access pass to medical coding and billing pro tips that help you start your week off smarter. And now, here is your host, Toni Elhoms.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Alpha Coding Podcast series. I am your host, Toni Elhoms. Welcome to episode 61 of the podcast. Today is March 1st. Welcome to a brand new month and starting on a Monday. So this past week, I was interviewed by my good friend, Victoria Mole, on her YouTube channel, Contempo Coding. So definitely check out that interview. It was so much fun. So I'm super excited for today's episode because I have an awesome guest joining us today, and we're going to be talking all about leveraging data analytics to combat fraud, waste, and abuse. So before we dive into our topic, it's time for your Monday dose of positivity, the Mindset Monday tip, and it's brought to you by Careo. Is your current EHR giving you headaches and impacting your cash flow? With Careo's integrated solution, you can rest assured knowing that Careo will deliver a complete technology suite that allows providers to effortlessly manage all functions of their practice in one place. This means less paperwork, increased patient satisfaction, happier providers, and better outcomes. Visit our website, alphacodingexperts.com, and head over to the Deals and Discounts tab for a link to access exclusive pricing. So our Mindset Monday tip is all about learning from our experiences. The quote I want to share with you says, "Nothing ever goes away until it teaches us what we need to know." And I think this is so true because if you look back at your previous experiences, previous relationships, past mistakes, and you start to notice a pattern, it's very likely that that pattern continues to reoccur because it's a lesson that you're supposed to learn. It's a lesson that you're supposed to grow through. And by avoiding those lessons that we need to learn and grow through, those patterns and those types of toxic relationships and those types of toxic people will continue to reemerge in our life. Transformation is a process. So if you notice a pattern of constantly repeating the same mistakes or ending up in these toxic relationships, always be on the lookout for how you can grow and learn from that experience. So our guest for today is Karen Weintraub from Hunterdon, New Jersey. Karen is the Executive Vice President at Healthcare Fraud Shield. They are a software provider that specializes in fraud, waste, and abuse detection. Karen has extensive expertise in compliance and conducting special investigations. Karen also has an awesome podcast, the Healthcare Fraud Shield podcast, which you should definitely check out. I invited Karen on the show today to discuss her best pro tips for leveraging data analytics to combat fraud, waste, and abuse. So thank you for joining us today, Karen.
Thank you, Toni. It's so nice to be a part of your podcast, which I listen to as well. So I'm certainly happy to be here.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. So let's break this down for our audience. How exactly do insurance companies leverage data to detect fraud, waste, and abuse?
Sure. I thought it might be helpful to just talk about what fraud, waste, and abuse is, just for a few seconds, in case folks want to understand the difference, and then that can help figure out when you're looking at this in the industry, the best approaches. So first of all, fraud. I think everyone's familiar with that word, but it does have some key pieces to it. There is an intentional component to it, where someone is doing something intentionally and providing false or misleading information, and in some cases omitting information, and then they get some kind of value or benefit out of it. Usually it's money, not always. Sometimes, you've seen some things in the news where it could be a jet or some other things that we probably won't talk about. We'll keep this kind of PC, but it's a benefit of some sort. And then you have waste, which is just something that's lost through carelessness or inefficiencies or ignorance. And then the word abuse, and that typically applies to things that are just not done consistently with generally accepted standards or practices related to this industry. It's kind of important to know the differences because there actually are different approaches for all three of them, even though they really do fall under the same umbrella. Some payers and insurance companies will look at it a little bit differently. So you've got claim systems, which every insurance company has of some sort. Some of them have many claim systems, multiples, and those have built-in edits already. And those edits will usually find some of that waste, and in some cases that abuse. So things that are just done in error or just out of the norm, but there can certainly be gaps in those edits. In addition, not all claims processing systems look at every aspect of what a typical fraud, waste, and abuse solution would look at. So sometimes claim editing systems will look at that specific claim or just a couple of pieces of information, but they're not always looking at just the larger picture or the patterns of behavior. So different departments within the insurance companies look at the data in many different ways for many different reasons. And, that information on the claim is not the only thing that's relevant. So you've got information about the procedures, but you also have information about who's rendering the service, who's billing for it, who's the patient. And then there's also a whole host of additional data sources that can be relevant. So when you think about how are they leveraging the data, it's not even just that one single claim. It can be a combination of different aspects of information related to that claim. And that's why an overall fraud, waste, and abuse solution is really helpful, because it's not looking at just one piece. It's not looking at just that waste or just that abuse. It's really looking at the full picture, including information that may not be on the claim as well, that could be helpful in detecting potential fraud, waste, and abuse.
That's super fascinating. And I really like how you broke down the fraud, waste, and abuse and how those are separate areas for the listeners. I think that's super helpful. In your experience, what are the most common services or specialties that are engaging in these
I
activities?
get this question a lot. I don't ever want any specialty to think that they're being targeted. So I always kind of feel badly answering it. So I think it's important that folks know that most specialties, there's some level of potential fraud, waste, and abuse. So overall, fraud, waste, and abuse is not the majority; it is the minority. But that minority can account for a significant amount of dollars. That being said, I would say as a result of just how the data is, there are certain services which lend themselves to certain specialties, which just pop up more. So if you kind of think about your own personal lives, who do you see the most often? Your family physician. I can tell you, like, I see a chiropractor every couple of weeks. Or if you've got some kind of something like diabetes, you're going to have supplies sent on a regular basis. So you tend to see that stuff more, things such as the DME services, durable medical equipment, because people are receiving those services more. Office visits for whether it's your family physician or some kind of specialist. Things that you would see someone quite often, like my chiropractor, who I see often. So I don't mean to pick on them, but it's the type of specialties that you'll see more volume of services just tend to bubble up. So physical therapy, chiropractic, behavioral health, pain management, again, the DME, just because of the nature of them. Because they bubble up, it doesn't mean that people who do what we do are not looking at the other ones. It's just, again, the volume that you see, sometimes that's what there tends to be a focus on. So really all services and specialties have a potential for fraud, waste, and abuse.
So I love your stories that you share on your podcast. Take us back to your days in the special investigations unit. What is the most egregious offense you've ever encountered?
Yeah, this is tough. I was thinking about egregiousness. Again, another thing that we get asked about. I think people look at egregiousness in different ways. For some, depending on the focus of the investigation, the egregious offense could actually be patient harm. And hopefully it's not. And if it's not patient harm, then the egregiousness relates to just how much money they're trying to bilk the system for. So that's where the greed comes in. So two main areas are greed and potential harm. So I've seen things where patients have certain ailments that really just kind of pull at your heartstrings. Could be some form of cancer, and you're seeing providers either do things that they shouldn't be doing, or maybe they really didn't have cancer and they're providing services as if they did. I think most of us have probably seen or heard some high profile cases in the news. One earlier this year that was on the show American Greed about, I think his name was, they called him Dr. Death, who's performing surgeries on the spine and
Oh
really
my gosh.
doing permanent damage and in some cases even worse, some cases death. Years ago, there was a provider in the news, Dr. Fada, who was treating people for cancer who didn't have it. And again, major damage and in some cases death. So those are the types of things that when you see, I think about that as the patient harm. And maybe I didn't see it as to that extent, but I have seen scenarios in my experiences in the past where providers did tell the patients that they potentially had cancer and they were doing testing on them that wasn't necessary. Thankfully, there was no patient harm in those scenarios. But just having someone think that they could have something like cancer is just not forgivable for me to see. And then, of course, you've got the money, the greed, and I've seen scenarios with hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars that folks have tried to bilk the system for. So that's always tough. The things that we've seen over the years, it just varies from, they could be lying about, hey, I rendered these services, but I was really on vacation. So no patient harm, but they got money they shouldn't have. To billing for things that higher complexity levels. Again, those are more of the greed aspect. So I would just kind of bucket egregiousness in two different ways. Potential harm, physical or mental, to the patient. Thinking that you might have cancer when you don't is just not acceptable. And then of course the greed aspect of it. So I'd say that the most egregiousness is patients thinking they have a disease that they didn't.
Wow, absolutely. Man, that is just, it's unbelievable that there's people out there that are doing this. So digital health exploded with the COVID-19 pandemic, and there have been some significant fraud, waste, and abuse cases that have come out. What fraud, waste, and abuse trends are you seeing in your world specific to digital health, remote patient monitoring, telehealth?
Yeah, this has definitely been an issue. Telehealth has really been on the rise, even before COVID-19, but COVID-19 has certainly catapulted it to the forefront of discussion of this industry. There are some numbers through, if you've heard of the company Fair Health, they've posted some interesting numbers online about just the increase in telehealth visits and why people are getting telehealth visits. One of the things that we've been monitoring as part of the telehealth surge is through the public health emergency, or the PHE. A number of services are now allowed digitally that were not allowed before. That public health emergency has been extended through April as of right now, could get extended again. But these are the things that we've seen some possible areas of abuse. So you've got services, again, that were never performed in the home, that through the phone or through the computer, or however they're doing it, that are being done now. And I've seen really an increase in not just office visits, not just regular, hey, how you feeling? I've got an ear infection, but also a tremendous increase in telehealth around behavioral health. Some of that is sorely needed. A lot of folks are battling a lot of anxiety and depression, especially from the last year. But there's definitely some folks that are taking advantage of the ability to bill that way. So we have been continuously diligent in making sure that our software is catching folks that are doing things that even in this environment are outside the norm for the current environment.
So what's your best advice for industry professionals that may be in an organization that condones or encourages fraudulent coding and billing practices? And just to add to that, how much have you seen as far as coding and billing professionals being held accountable for these types of practices?
Sure. I know you're definitely more entrenched in the coding world than I am at this point. And I'm sure the discussions you've had as well, you've seen this is tough for folks. Well, first of all, I'd say be careful. When you see something, you should, what's the popular phrase, see something, say something. So you do need to report it. Now, some of these practices, depending on the nature of them, they may not have a robust compliance program or may not have one at all. If they do have one, then it should be reported. Uh, so that's, I would say, is number one. I always say if there's something suspect going on, you also want to start documenting and have a log of all the activity, because you also want to be careful that you're not kind of brought in, especially if you really have had no direct impact on any of the potential fraudulent billing. You don't want to be implicated in that. In addition, the other things that they can do, every state has their own agency depending on the types of products that you're working with. So if you're working with commercial lines of business, then there's usually some kind of form of Department of Insurance. If you're working with Medicaid, there's a separate agency for Medicaid. If you're working with Medicare, there's the OIG, Office of Inspector General. So you want to make sure that you report to the appropriate agency or agencies, depending on what you're seeing. There's another avenue that I know a lot of folks don't think about, just because it's a billing issue and not necessarily a practice issue as far as the type of service or the quality of their service, but the Board of Medical Examiners as well is another avenue. So I'd want to be careful that you're reporting it, you're documenting it, and if you really are at a place that's encouraging folks to do that you take all those steps and then you try to find a way to get out. That's not the type of place I would think that you want to be involved with as an employee. But I have seen where some legitimate cases where the coders or the billers at the practices were involved. Typically, you'll also see that more so, perhaps in a billing company could be a possibility as well, where it's a general practice of how to approach the coding and billing. But I have also seen it at small practices or smaller practices that don't have a billing company as well.
That's great advice. I like what you said. See something, say something.
That's what they say at the airport, right?
Say something. That's true. So what are your top 3 pro tips for leveraging data analytics to combat fraud, waste, and abuse?
First tip I say is don't jump to a conclusion. That's number one. Data, I've seen a lot of scenarios where people look at something and they say, oh, look what I found. This is great. I've found fraud, and which we always want to be careful. You don't want to assume that it's fraud, and there's a lot that has to happen before it can even be labeled as fraud. That's why you'll hear me say potential fraud a lot. So don't jump to a conclusion. There are things in your data or whatever data you're looking at that could be pointing to something, but there may be a legitimate explanation for it, because this is a complicated area. So you don't want to just assume. So that would be number one. Number two, because of that, learn as much about the data as you can. Where did it come from? How did it get populated? Many insurance companies, as I alluded to before, have multiple claim systems, and they may all work differently. So depending on how you're looking at the data, if they're siloed, if they're brought together, it could have a lot of nuances to it that you should be made aware of, because again, a nuance could lead to looking like something that isn't really what it looks like. So, you can get a really good understanding of the data by taking all those different steps. But to take it even further, there's so many things that you can be looking at. Again, in Medicaid or Medicare, we mentioned before, what's the type of product? Being a certified coder, I'd say when I first started out, this was one of the best things that I ever did. I started to really get more comfortable with just understanding the data, not just from, how it works from an insurance perspective, but how it gets billed and what's appropriate and what's not. So my third tip would be don't ever stop learning, because there's always more to learn, whether it's about the data, whether it's coding. There's just always something more. And I continue to look at, the coding magazines every month and new codes, and I'm just in awe of just how much there is to keep learning.
Yes, it is a full-time job to stay up with these changes. And I like what you said about the potential fraud. You want to be careful with the F word. It's a strong word.
Yes.
So tell us about your work at Healthcare Fraud Shield and what inspired you to start a podcast about it.
Sure. So Healthcare Fraud Shield, we are a fraud, waste, and abuse fully integrated software solution, kind of a one-stop shop where we look at data for our clients, prepayment, post-payment. We've got a case management tool. We've got AI. We've got a reporting tool. It's all really wrapped into one analytic solution. So even though we're a software company, we're not just software. We've got a lot of folks that are really just entrenched in this industry. They speak at conferences. We do webinars. We do news articles. So it's really important for us to share and educate as much as we can, and really provide not just our clients, but everyone in the industry information that would be helpful. So what better way than to add another, medium of presenting information? We're already doing articles and webinars. Might as well do a podcast. Not everyone's got time to sit and watch a webinar, but you may have time. Like for me, I walk my dogs and I listen to a podcast. So that's helpful to me because that's what I've got time for. So I wanted to provide another way for people to hear, what we're talking about.
I love your show. Seriously, you guys have the best stories.
It's a great career. It's a great industry. So the stories are fun for sure.
So what's next for you, Karen?
Just keep going, keep learning, keep innovating. We've got so many ideas that I think we'll be busy for a long time. So I think you'll see Healthcare Fraud Shield just keep growing, and we're just going to keep doing more and come up with more ways to just help the entire industry. So what's next is kind of hard. I think it's just more. Just keep going. We're just never going to stay stagnant. I don't think we could anyway. Just not in our nature.
Well, this has been absolutely fascinating. I think you've shared such valuable insights for our listeners. So thank you so much, Karen.
No, and thank you. And thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it.
So definitely be sure to connect with Karen on LinkedIn and also check out the Healthcare Fraud Shield podcast. So it's time for this week's coding pro tip, and is brought to you by Contempo Coding, which is an on-demand educational resource provider created for coders by coders. They specialize in affordable coding certification prep courses to help you accelerate in your career. Right now, they're offering an exclusive special to Alpha Coding podcast listeners, and that's $125 off the Certified Risk Adjustment Coding Prep course, as well as some great bonus content when you order through our affiliate website. This course has a 100% pass rate, by the way. Visit our website, alphacodingexperts.com, and head over to the Deals and Discounts tab for a link to take advantage of this absolute steal of a deal. If you have a coding-related question and would like it to be featured in one of our coding pro tips, please reach out to me on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, or YouTube. So this week's coding pro tip comes to us from South Carolina. Hi, Toni. Thanks for all you do for our community. Your topics are always so informative, and I can really see the passion that you put into your work. I'm having a lot of trouble understanding when OMT and office visits can be reported together. Our DOs are insistent upon charging an office visit for every encounter, even when the patient is specifically scheduled for OMT. Can you offer any advice? Well, first of all, I want to say thank you for the kind words and for being a supporter of the podcast. I used to get into so many heated debates with DOs when I did a lot of provider education, but the biggest thing is going to be looking at modifier 25. Is that office visit significant and separately identifiable from the OMT treatment? If the decision was already determined that the patient would receive OMT and they're scheduled for an OMT encounter, then that's going to be an instance where the office visit is not going to be billable. And also, the decision to perform OMT is not enough always to constitute that significant and separately identifiable E&M service. So it always comes down to the clinical documentation and carving out what is separate from that pre and post procedural standard of care. This is where you have to really dissect that assessment and plan to see what is significant and separately identifiable. This is a major issue. You're definitely not the only person that struggles with this. So one of the things that I would do when I would meet with DOs about this issue is I would pull their clinical documentation and show them examples of when their OMT and an office visit was supported and when OMT and an office visit were not supported. So showing them those concrete examples of their own clinical documentation can be really helpful to them. I hope that points you in the right direction. Please remember to hit that subscribe button now so you never miss another episode. Also, be sure to drop us a 5-star rating and review on iTunes. We really appreciate your support. So this concludes today's episode. Until next week, thank you for listening to the Alpha Coding Podcast. We'll see you next Monday.
For more information about medical coding and billing pro tips, including how to hire alpha coding experts, follow us on LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, or visit our website at www.alphacodingexperts.com.